Hi, this is just a really quick little lecture on the literary transitions of horror fiction between the 1880s and the early 1900s to about the 1930s. This is primarily driven by print culture, as we talked about in a previous module with the Penny Dreadfuls. Penny Dreadfuls were of cheap quality, but a little better quality than some of the pulp narratives or the pulp magazines that came out in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, both in Britain and in America. The primary pulp fiction magazines that you might be familiar with or may have heard of are things like detective magazines, and then also the famous Weird Stories, which H.P. Lovecraft and some of his contemporaries published in. And we'll get into that a little bit here as we go along. So, the main thing in the transition period is this distinction between high literature and low literature. So, high literature are things like the ghost stories of M.R. James in England. They became popularized not only during the late 1800s, but then during the 1960s and 70s when Britain put out ghost stories around Christmas time. They were often based on M.R. James's ghost stories, and those were considered high literature. The same thing goes on the American side for Henry James' Turn of the Screw is another example. You may not know the story, The Turn of the Screw, but chances are you might be familiar with Mike Flanagan's version on Netflix called The Haunting of Bly Manor. Worth checking out. He subverts the story quite well. It's not an exact retelling, but it's worth checking out. So that is high literature. Low literature is Bram Stoker's Dracula. And even though it was really popular when it came out in the late 1800s, there was this idea of Dracula was, of course, talking about taboo things such as diseases, sex. You get diseases through sex, that sort of thing. And it became more graphic and focused on the physical horror. So if you ever have the opportunity to read Bram Stoker's Dracula, the descriptions of Dracula as sort of a walking skeleton, and I'm paraphrasing here, are meant to be gory, graphic, horrific. So in the vein of the current Nosferatu release that just came out around Christmas time here in 2024, that I believe that depiction is pretty close, actually, probably truer to what Bram Stoker had envisioned Dracula looking like than other earlier remakes of the story. So basically, by the time we get to the late 1800s, popular culture now is viewed through the lens of skepticism, and horror becomes linked to sensationalism and gore. Again, so due to the somewhat popularity of Dracula, although Dracula got a lot more love after Stoker's death than they did at the time, but it's a great example of, well, physical horror, graphic, taboo, so on and so forth. So that's where we're headed. We're going from high literature down to lower literature during this particular time period. Which leads us into the central themes during this time period. And these themes should look familiar to you. They are very similar, if not the same, to a lot of the texts that we have already covered. The difference here is there's more of a distinction between the highbrow horror, right? And now we're moving into lowbrow horror, what is considered lowbrow horror. So, what do we have? We have body as the site of horror. We have degeneration, mutation, and pain, which we'll start right off with Bram Stoker's Dracula. He is a horrible looking count. One of the main themes that runs through the novel is catching of disease through sexual activity, which then makes you sick. It can cause degeneration of the body, mutation in the form of syphilis, and so on and so forth. So we're starting right off the bat with Bram Stoker's Dracula. The next is scientific hubris and ethical ambiguity. Now, we saw this with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but by 1885, the writer Robert Louis Stevenson wrote the Curious Case or The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1885. And in that, briefly, the story is of a doctor who creates a potion that turns him into this horribly disfigured monster, and what he does is goes out and commits crimes. It's a really, really thin novella. Chances are you've probably seen references to it in popular culture. The one that comes to mind is the Bugs Bunny cartoon. I don't know if you have ever seen anything like that on streaming or on cable, but that's the first one that pops into my head, although I know that they have referenced the story in various TV shows and movies throughout the decades. The next is the cultural decay, moral collapse, and you'll probably never guess where I'm going here. This goes towards Oscar Wilde and his work, The Portrait of Dorian Gray, which was published in 1891. Now, a little bit about Oscar Wilde. He was somewhat of a playboy, or was the quintessential playboy of his era. He loved to party, do various substances, and then, of course, his worst crime was being gay. He was jailed for a time for those activities. So they looked at this as cultural decay, moral collapse, all of those wonderful things. Kind of similar to what we have going on today, I could argue, depending on your cultural stance and viewpoint. And then lastly, in terms of central themes, we have a tension between rational explanation and occult mystery. Now, I'm going to introduce a name that might be familiar to you or it might be new, but H.G. Wells and his novel, The Time Machine. And his work makes a really great transition into the early 1900s, particularly the 1920s, and H.P. Lovecraft's work. In The Time Machine, there is this tension between the sort of scientific rational explanation or the sci-fi fantasy that we can time travel. Now, of course, we can't time travel, but for readers during the late 1800s, his scientific explanations made sense. So there was some idea there that there was a rationality. But within the story itself, the time travelers actually dreamed of being touched by horrible tentacles that sort of came out and like an octopus or a squid. So start thinking of Cthulhu and H.P. Lovecraft's mythos. So it makes a nice little segue into that. Of course, H.P. Lovecraft was familiar with all of the authors to some degree that I have just went over in this last slide, and it leads us to the role of, or the rise of, the film industry. And that's where I'm going to leave us, because our readings deal with this particular time period from the late 1800s into the early 1900s, and then of course our module goes a little further than that. But with this little transition period, we have the birth of silent film. And the one that always comes up, and I believe I gave a link to it in the first module, is the 1930 silent film Nosferatu, 1931, excuse me, to be exact. It is a blatant ripoff of Bram Stoker's Dracula, but the German filmmakers did not have permission from the Bram Stoker estate to turn the story into a movie. But did they let anything like copyright stop them? No, they did not. And of course, it has become an iconic film in all of horror films, actually. And that's where I'm going to leave us, is the silent film era in 1931, and our module will take us up to and through the horrors of World War II and right after World War II. So we should be getting into some familiar territory for most of you as we continue on.